Hello, everyone, and welcome to the YouTube video series From Anti to Ally, the series where I go over how to talk to friends and family and others who are maybe skeptical or new to social justice movements and how to address their skepticism, how to address their opposition, and be real proponents of change. My name is Barry Regan. I'm a professor of communication at Central Arizona College. And what I want to do in this YouTube video series is to produce several episodes to break down issues related to inequality, change, and justice that have to do with what white folks can do to help be agents of change and also to be proponents and supporters of people of color who are looking to make big structural changes to inequality, especially in American society. And what I hope that you'll get from this YouTube video series is not to feel attacked or to feel like you have to be defensive based off who you are or what you believe, but instead listen to what maybe are counter arguments to things that you have heard. Maybe listening to and asking yourself questions that you may never have considered before. Because as I'll talk about throughout these episodes, my real goal is not to be kind of another person who is going to be telling you you're bad for this, but instead saying, here's maybe the belief system you came from. Here's maybe some of the benefits that have come from that system you're not aware of. And here's how being aware of it and working to reverse it can bring not just benefits to people around American society and around the world, but also can bring benefits to you. And that's the goal in this series. So I want to start off and talk a little bit about why I have such a passion for this topic. And one of the things that you must know about me before I became a professor of communication and I taught intercultural communication and the other things that I'll discuss, I was your very typical suburban white boy. And what I mean by that is I grew up in the Central Coast of California. I started at a pretty young age listening to hip hop and rap. And I became kind of what you imagine every late 90s, early 2000s Eminem lover was, which is someone who took elements of what I thought it meant to be Black and performed it because I saw it as cool. I saw it as being not kind of the nerdy person that I was, but identifying with something that had kind of a real cachet that I wanted to perform and to be around. And what I didn't realize at the time until I left my, very safe, nice, pretty wealthy area in the Central Coast of California, and I went to Las Vegas to go to college, I, for the first time, started to be around people of different races, different backgrounds, different experiences. And it wasn't until I integrated myself, not just physically, but intellectually with people who were different than me, did I realize not just the benefits that I grew up with that I wasn't even aware of, but how I was able to feel comfortable seeing acts of racism and seeing acts of other terrible things happening and think, oh man, that sucks, but not really doing anything about it. And I bring this up because I imagine, you or friends you have or family members you have may have a similar upbringing, right? We're really good at calling out, say, someone who's using the N-word or someone maybe who says something like comparing themselves to owners or slave masters. But we're not as good in society calling out the more subliminal, smaller, or oftentimes more hidden behaviors that we are afraid to confront. And so what I want to do in this first video today is to really talk about the idea of white privilege based off of the experiences I've had. So I'm lucky enough now at Central Arizona College to serve for the past year and a half on the Diversity Inclusion Advisory Council. I've also been very lucky, to start last year doing some preliminary work with the Anti-Racism Coalition of the Episcopal Diocese of Arizona. And these experiences in very different forms with different people have taught me the necessity of having conversations with people who are maybe uncomfortable talking about what it means to have white privilege, maybe even to acknowledge that white privilege exists, but also to talk about the benefits of how discussing white privilege and discussing the benefits of interrogating it can have for everyone involved. And so that's my goal in this today, is to take my kind of experiences I've had, the mistakes that I've made, the things that I've learned from people over time to then help explain what can white folks do to have those difficult conversations with friends and family to improve the world for everyone. Okay, so I want to first off discuss what white privilege is. And look, this is a conversation that could take hours and hours and hours for us to have. But what I want to really distill down to is something that's more digestible and understandable for those who maybe haven't had much exposure to this idea, or maybe as a way to frame it for those who are skeptical of it. And so when you hear the term white privilege, I think the best way to think of it in terms of actions and how it proliferates or how it spreads is to look at it the way that author Peggy McIntosh, and those of you who have done research or have experience in this will know this article that I'm talking about, where she writes in her article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, that white privilege essentially is like kind of an invisible backpack of items that we have with us. And one of the kind of invisible backpack items that she discusses is that as white folks, we are taught to see racism as individual acts of meanness, not as invisible or hidden or more subliminal or below the surface systems that allow white folks to have a sense of benefit above acts of racism, to look at it as individual, not as systemic. Okay? And I bring this up because, I am recording this on May 30th, 2020. And right now, American culture and society writ large is really being dominated by the horrific and racist death of George Floyd, the African-American man in Minnesota who was choked out by a police officer. And one of the arguments that I'll get to here in a minute and in other videos is this idea that, hey, not all cops or not all blank folks are racist. Therefore, you can't use this as a way to generalize, or you can't see this as a structural problem. The problem is, as I'll get into in later videos, this is not the first time this has happened. There are a bevy of statistics that I will get into that demonstrate how people of color are targeted, are arrested, are imprisoned, and also have acts of violence committed against them by law enforcement at a significantly higher rate to their population than do folks who are white or appear to be white. And the ability to look at those distinctions is a big one. But before we get there, I want to get to the idea of how white privilege is able to persist. And one of the most difficult elements to white privilege, that is the acknowledgement that as a white person, I have certain benefits that I may not be aware of that allow me to live a different life than those around me who don't look like me. The main barrier that I'm sure you've experienced or you've had family members experience is this idea of like, look, I'm not privileged. Here's what my family has gone through. Here's what I've gone through. And I think a good way to encapsulate this argument that you hear of I am not privileged, or you don't know me, you can't judge, or no one said that I got this job because I was white. The best encapsulation of this, the ideology of this argument, was put by a Princeton student in 2014 who wrote an op-ed in the Princeton student newspaper as well as in Time magazine. And I think that this section sums up this argument pretty well, where he writes, that's the problem with calling out someone for privilege, which you assume has defined their narrative. You don't know their struggles, what they have been through, what they may have gone through, assuming they benefited from power systems or other conspiratorial imaginary institutions, denies them credit for all they've done, things of which they may not even conceive. You don't know whose father died defending your freedom. You don't know whose mother escaped oppression. You don't know who conquered their demons or maybe still be conquering them now. And the sentiment that this Princeton student outlined, I think on the surface is a compelling point. That is, like, for example, I come from an Irish and Scottish cultural background. As people of European history know, Irish and Scottish were oppressed by the British for a long period of time, and still to this day still are to some degree, especially in Scotland. And so the notion that we associate privilege with life being easy has been deconstructed by opponents, and I think used effectively to discredit people who talk about white privilege. The problem is, and one thing that I really teach in my classes, is that what this student is calling out is not what white privilege is saying, right? White privilege is not the idea that as white folks, we essentially are given kind of like that easy pass at Disneyland, where it's like, oh, struggle, economic, like economic struggle to fight for freedom, the struggle to like make a good living for your your family. Cool, you get to go right on through, right? That's not what white privilege is saying. The reason I bring this up is because I want to talk about not just what's wrong with this argument, but also how overcoming this argument can bring real benefits to people. So the first thing I want to say is, one, that privilege is not this idea that struggle has never happened, okay? Instead, white privilege is the idea that there are foundations for my ideology, thoughts about who I am and what I believe to be right, that I don't have to have confronted in my life because of the color of my skin. And it's easy to kind of break this down, show why it's wrong, which I'll get into. But the best strategy to talk to friends and family who may be resistant to discussions of white privilege or don't think it truly exists, or think that those who say it exists go too far, there are 3 or 4 main strategies I want to give you that should help in those conversations. Okay? So when you meet a family member, when you meet a friend who says a lot of what that student just wrote in that Time magazine article, here are some things to do to overcome those barriers and to move the conversation forward. Okay? The first is asking them, what is race? And I bring this up because, my current and former students often joke with me that I'm too in love with the Socratic method of questioning, which is essentially to ask questions with a purpose to really challenge the person you're conversing with to deeply think out their answer, to not just speak off the top of their head, but to really dig down into what I call the attitudinal anchors, or the core of their belief system, to respond. And this question, what is race, is a good starting point, because there is a misconception about race is. What we acknowledge is that race is not solely the color of your skin. Race is a sociological construct. And what that essentially means is race is something that has been created in human society to categorize differences between people that we see. Think of it like this. If you were, say, for example, now identifying as Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, in 1960, when you saw the US Census, you were essentially said you can identify as white, African American, Asian, Native American. Those were your options. So if you are, say, a brown skin, you identify as Chicano, Hispanic, or Latino, you had no way to construct what you truly were, how your culture defines you. And what happened over time is we recognized the role that, say, people who are Chicano, not just the color of their skin, but the role their culture plays in making them uniquely different from others, means that we had to adapt our understanding of race. And so that's when you saw the United States Census add in more nuanced distinctions of race. Getting opponents of white privilege to recognize that our understandings of what race is sociologically have changed over time, have improved, and developed more nuance, means that you're able to explain to them, hey, because our understandings of race have changed and what it is, we need to then understand what that greater awareness brings us knowledge-wise. And that awareness of what changes in our understanding of race have brought us knowledge-wise brings me to the second question, and one that I have found to oftentimes be the most effective in these conversations. And that is asking people who are white, who are skeptical or resistant to thinking of white privilege, asking them, what is your culture? What culture do you identify as? And here's why this question is so important. In my intercultural communication class, I have an assignment where students have to define their culture, explain the different beliefs, values, norms, and social practices that make up their culture, and then also historical forces that have shaped it. Every semester, pretty much without fail, my African American, Latino, Native American students, pretty easy. They know what their culture is, how they define it, and the examples of different norms, values, beliefs, social practices. Also, what happens almost every semester is that my students who are white will come up to me and say, I don't really have a culture, or I don't really know what my culture is, or, hey, I just think of myself as an American. And what I challenge them to do when they tell me that is to say, if you can, look up where your cultural roots are from. That is, do your ancestors come from, say, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, Italy, Greece? Where do they come from? And there are several reasons I ask them that question. Number one is it will help demonstrate to them, usually if they do the work and they really do the history, is that their culture more than likely is derived from usually kind of a country in Europe that's influenced by the Enlightenment. So I don't want to go too much into philosophy at the moment, but what I will say is, when you think about Western European cultures, of which primarily white folks come from, and even to some degree, Eastern European cultures influenced by this too, they often have their beliefs or values rooted in the Enlightenment, right? Which is the 16th and 17th century period where you had several philosophers, whether they be John Locke, Rene Descartes, a whole bunch of folks. They came up with kind of understandings of truth, of governing, of kind of political ideology. And so the foundation set by those thinkers during that time period is really what influences a lot of white American culture and beliefs and values today. Here's why that's important. The Enlightenment and the thinkers from the Enlightenment grew up in racially monolithic societies in the 16th and 17th century. The United Kingdom, what is now Scotland and Ireland, France, Germany, Italy, those are countries that were at that time almost 100% white. They didn't have to think about racial or cultural diversity when coming up with the ideology of, or the foundations of their ideology. Here's why that's so important. If the origin of your ideology and the foundation of it did not have to consider the unique experiences of people from different cultures or different backgrounds, they're able to develop, be ingrained, and progress over time from that foundation, which leads us back to today. So when you see so many white folks resistant to talking about white privilege or resistant to talking about what is whiteness, it often goes back to the fact that as white folks, we don't have to be aware of our race throughout the day. We can identify as American, or we can identify essentially just as, like a regular American, because we are not reminded of what our race is and what that stands for. And so what I always do is to recommend for folks who want to have real authentic conversations with friends and family, ask them where that culture is. Ask them where it's from. What was their foundation in? And more than likely, their cultural roots will be steeped in Western European culture that's rooted in the time of the Enlightenment, where the ideology was shaped without having to consider or think about or acknowledge different races and different cultures. Here's why that's so important. Once you get folks to realize that, what their culture is, what its foundations are, where it comes from, it now gives them perspective to hopefully answer the third question, which is, how often are you reminded each day that you're white? And this is an important question because without a doubt, when you are, say, African American, Latino, Chicano, Hispanic, Asian American, Native American, other what we consider racial minorities, there are different sociocultural factors reminding you every day of your race, whether it be someone asking you to touch or asking to touch your hair, whether it's maybe changing the dialect or the way they talk around you, whether it's friends or family who remind you of your racial ethnic heritage to give you pride. Racial minorities are reminded of this all the time. So the awareness of their own culture, the awareness of the beliefs and values are there. It creates this solid sense of identity. However, as white folks, we don't have that. In fact, we benefit from not being reminded of our race, of oftentimes interacting in friend groups or going into stores or traveling to places where we never have to worry about being the only white person in the room, or even what being the only white person in the room means. And one of the important elements to this discussion is I had a debate one time with a friend who brought up, look, if I'm white and I go to, say, the Middle East or I go into South America, I will be persecuted just like, say, someone in Syria is in, the United States, or someone in say, like Senegal or Ethiopia is in Western Europe. And so the argument they were making is, look, oppression happens to all races, just depends on where you live. My response to them was, okay, you're from Syria. You go to Western Europe now. You're more likely to face discrimination based off what's happened and based off how there's a changing shift in how refugees are viewed. You go from Syria to the United States. If you've been paying attention to the news, you saw the travel ban that was put in place by the Trump administration, upheld by the Supreme Court. There is a legal backing that shows skepticism of your acceptance into our culture. You go to South America, you go to East Asia, you're faced maybe not with the same degree of discrimination, but that sense of alienation. Now imagine you're white. You can go to the wealthiest, most powerful countries on the earth: Germany, France, United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia. And you will be seen as part of the norm, part of the majority. And that awareness of how race functions on a worldwide level is so important, because how often you're reminded of your race is not just needed to have perspective and awareness. It also is meant to help provide you an understanding that where you can go to seek refuge or seek help and how accepted you are is oftentimes determined by your race and how aware you are of that. And this finally brings me, I think, to one of the most important parts to this whole discussion, and something that I hope you'll take away from this, which is, okay, now, I've interrogated my race, I've thought about being white, so what? And what I say to this is that there are real benefits to you as a white person and to your friends and to family to acknowledge, to be aware of, and to interrogate your white privilege. And let's talk about it first in the context of something I feel most comfortable talking about, which is communication. So number one, by acknowledging your white privilege and acknowledging the way in which you have benefited from different structural issues, the more meaningful connections and friendships you can create with people who are different than you. And this has some really important beneficial reasons. One is that the natural human need for acceptance and our natural need to boost our self-concept through the affirmation of others around us is super key. And so one of the key examples that I've talked about with my communication students for years now is the unfortunate example of a child called It, or a child named Jeannie. And it was a girl who was born in 1957 in the Inland Empire of California. And in 1970, she was discovered by authorities to have been largely chained to a toilet for almost the entirety of her life up to that point, in one of the worst instances of child abuse that's ever been witnessed. And the reason why I bring this up is not to take a hard issue and make it even more depressing, but instead to explain what happened to her. And what happened to this child is that for the rest of her life, and she's still alive today, she had to live in assisted living. She couldn't live on her own. And the reason is, and communication psychology scholars have talked about this, she wasn't given a chance to socialize. It wasn't the fact that her bones actually grew out and over the toilet so she can only walk as a bunny hop, which unfortunately is the case, but because she was never taught to communicate and to create a self-concept. So to bring this down from this kind of big level of self-concept, to bring it down to something more manageable, the more you interact with people who are like you, who are different than you, the more you're aware of how you are different from others and how you can acknowledge and work on that difference, builds your self-concept in a more healthy and holistic way. Because our self-concept is oftentimes determined by how we think other people see us. And if other people of different races, cultures, backgrounds see us as empathetic or acknowledge kind of the benefits we had growing up because of the color of our skin, the more it deepens those connections with others, it boosts our self-concept, creates a more holistic understanding. And of course, right, the second part, it decreases our stress and anxiety during social interactions. If you have unacknowledged white guilt, or you are defensive, say, about maybe someone talking about white privilege or feeling like whiteness has benefits, your anxiety decreases in interactions with people from different countries or races or ethnicities, and your stress and your defensiveness increase. Now, we know this can have real physical harms, right? When we have increased stress and anxiety in social interactions, it tends to impact us, one, by decreasing not just our communication with those folks, but decreased stress levels can lead to higher blood pressure. They can lead to cardiovascular and other health problems. And if this persists for a long time, it can have really long-lasting impacts on our body. So no joke when I say that acknowledging white privilege, being open about it, making connections with people who are different than you, or say who are also white and want to acknowledge their privilege and how to work to change it. It decreases your stress and anxiety in social interactions. It allows you to have a more open self-concept, an understanding, and as I'll get into here in a second, an increased empathy for people who are not like you. And empathy, this idea of being able to decenter from your own perspective and put yourself in the perspective of others, has several psychological and communication benefits. One, it makes you feel more accepted and included, which boosts your self-esteem. Two, it also increases your awareness of the world around you. So it allows you to create more accurate perceptions of the world, right? So if you, say, only go to visit Phoenix, say in December, where I live here in Arizona, and think, oh, it's 70 degrees. It's nice and cool here year round. But if you visit like 20, 30 times, including right now here at the end of May, where it's 110 degrees out, you start to have a more accurate perception of what's true long term. And so empathizing by acknowledging your privilege and what allows you to have a different experience from others, and trying to take yourself out of your own experience and put it in the perspective of others, boosts your empathy, which boosts your self-esteem, and it boosts your connection to society. Here's why this is so important. One of the most difficult parts of the discussion of structural racism and white privilege is to acknowledge that those who perpetuate the hate to such a large degree often have the least exposure with people in different cultures. And I'll talk about this in future videos, one of the saddest, most difficult parts of the white privilege debate is to recognize those who are most defensive or least willing to engage are the ones who have largely been surrounded by the most white people and the least amount of folks from different cultures. And so by asking yourself, am I having conversations or seeking friendships and connections or letting people from different cultures challenge the way I was raised? If I'm not allowing myself to feel that, to experience that, it makes it easier for me to be blind to these issues. And most urgently and importantly, what I ask people to do is to think back, to the first day of your history or government class, and you think of the pride you probably felt when you saw the Declaration of Independence and how it represents some of the greatest promises given to human beings by a government anywhere in the world throughout history. And recognize the connection that acknowledging your own privilege, recognizing the racism that others experience, and working to have conversations with folks who disagree, making them feel accepted and wanting to be an ally for these movements. If you can do that work, that is your contribution to upholding the Declaration of Independence. That is, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness should not just be for folks with privilege who do not have to worry about what it's like to run down the street and to be chased by someone with a gun thinking you're a thief. To be laying on the ground and having their knee in your neck and having such disregard for your life that they let you die and not even realize it till it's pointed out. To be a little kid like Tamir Rice, to be running around with just a non-handgun and shot instantly and have the police officer acquitted. All of these examples, right, are the ultimate acts of betrayal to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I ask you, as part of this video series, at the end of each one, I will say to everybody, do your part to uphold life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everyone. Acknowledge your privilege, empathize with those who are different than you, and don't be silent. Thank you.